This episode is brought to you by Netflix's Remarkably Bright Creatures. What if a Pacific octopus held the key to a mystery that could heal your heart? Well, that's Tova's reality. An elderly widow working at an aquarium, Tova forms an unlikely friendship with the curmudgeonly Marcellus, whose remarkable intelligence leads her to a life-changing discovery. Remarkably Bright Creatures is now playing, only on Netflix.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to discuss the case of a young woman who was murdered at the peak of her career as a Playboy bunny model. She was killed in her flat in what seasoned police described as one of the most violent and brutal crime scenes that they had ever worked on. The deeper that detectives delved into the case, the more they began to uncover, and then they realised this young woman wasn't the only victim of her killer, leaving the haunting and terrifying question: was there a serial killer prowling, hunting on the streets of London? This is the murders of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon. Albert Stratford was an Englishman working in Germany in early 1950 following the end of the Second World War. Likely to provide the British soldiers still stationed there his care, Albert worked as a medic within the Royal Army Medical Corps. He met and then fell in love with a beautiful German woman named Liza. They would go on to marry and then have their daughter, Eve Stratford, who was born on the 28th of December 1953 in Dortmund, West Germany. Eve was an absolutely beautiful little girl, and all throughout her life she would get many compliments for her beauty. She was entered into and won several beauty competitions whilst living in Germany. Eventually the Stratfords moved to the UK, where the family settled in Aldershot, Hampshire, and here Eve settled in really well. She was the type of person who was very naturally chatty and outgoing. She was sociable, and so she made many friends easily. Very unsurprisingly, but Eve Stratford was a very popular young girl, and she had a big group of friends. She was bubbly, she loved to laugh, and she always had a smile on her face. Friends described Eve as a very girly girl. She loved her hair done, she loved her makeup on, and the colour pink. She was naturally very soft-hearted, she was caring in nature, and a really sweet girl. Albert would describe his daughter as also being incredibly smart. She spoke multiple languages. This is him.
Eve is a very bright girl, very intelligent, and also very beautiful. She spoke German fluently and Russian, so she had the intelligence to go and make something of her life.
It was Eve's dream to become a professional model, and she was determined that she was going to do it and she was going to do well. In 1973, she auditioned for a job within the very prestigious Playboy Club in Mayfair. This wasn't an easy job to get, and many women would be knocked back, turned away, because you needed a certain look, you needed to fit a very specific beauty standard, but you also needed some charisma, something about you. And Eve had all of that, so it was no surprise that she was offered a job pretty much straight away. Within the club, she would be known as Bunny Ava, and all of the women there would wear the iconic Playboy bunny outfits with matching tails and ears. The women who worked there absolutely loved it, and they would usually stay for years. The atmosphere inside of the club was good, and all of the girls got along. It was really hard work. The women were mostly in heels all day, every day, but the money was great, so the women were able to live very glamorous and luxurious lifestyles. Despite what people would think inside the club, the patrons, who were often successful businessmen, even celebrities like actors, singers and comedians, were not allowed to touch or be inappropriate with the women, who all used stage names. They weren't allowed to talk about their personal life, give out addresses, phone numbers, anything like that. By the time Eve got this job, she had moved into a flat on Lyndhurst Drive in Leyton, East London, with her rock star boyfriend, Tony Priest, who was a singer within a band named Vineyard. They had been dating for about a year, and by all accounts, they had a lovely relationship. Tony even later said that he and Eve had spoken about running off to Gretna Green to get married and devoting the rest of their lives together. But they would never get the opportunity. In March 1975, 22-year-old Eve was named Mayfair magazine's Girl of the Month, and she was on the front cover of the magazine, which was sold in virtually every shop in London. Mayfair is an adult magazine where the models would post nude, and that's what Eve had done. She had done modelling work before. She was the model on the front cover of an erotic thriller-esque book. But this Mayfair cover should have skyrocketed her career. It should have made her a household name. Following the publication of this, Eve was suspended from her job at the Playboy Club as she had worked with a rival company, a competitor of Playboy. So she was suspended for 3 months, which I can imagine was absolutely devastating for her. Eve loved her job. When such a good opportunity presents itself, sometimes, especially when you're so young, you just go for it and you're not really thinking about the repercussions of it. On the 18th of March 1975, Tony Priest left the Lyndhurst flat at around about 7:30 a.m. for a day of work, leaving his girlfriend Eve behind in bed. At about 9 a.m, the landlord showed up and briefly spoke to Eve as she paid him the weekly or monthly rent. She then spent the day dotting about London. She met her agent over in Camden for a meeting before heading to the Bayswater area where she was going to see a promotions consultant. At about 3:30 p.m, Eve is spotted walking down her street wearing a big floppy hat, protecting her face from the blistering cold of the snow. She was carrying a bouquet of dried flowers and heading towards her flat, which, by the way, wasn't like a big block or tower of flats. This was more like a big house which had been converted into 2 separate flats. This was the last confirmed sighting of Eve. Tony arrived back home after work at around about 5:20 p.m. This is him describing what he found.
I came home from work, usual time, walked up the steps at the side, let myself in. I remember saying, "Hey babe, I'm home." And just silence, and I'm thinking, it's funny. Didn't think, walked up the stairs, straight ahead was the bedroom. And I walked into our bedroom and found Eve. The penny didn't fall first. I mean, she was laying face down with her head turned to the side. I thought, are you out of it? I got down on one knee and moved her hair back to see her face. And then I suddenly realised I was kneeling in a pool of blood. And then the penny dropped.
What they did to your family, you're lucky to make it out alive.
Streaming on Peacock.
These men are going to come after me. Taking them out is my only chance.
Put a bullet in her head. From the co-creator of Ozark.
Looks like a family was running drugs.
Execution-style killing, it's rare for the keys. Any leads on who they might have been running for?
The cartel killed my family. I'm gonna kill them. All of them.
MIA. Streaming now. Only on Peacock.
At around 5:20 p.m, Tony Priest arrived back home after a day at work, calling out to his girlfriend, announcing that he was home, but was met with silence. He moved through the flat, going up the stairs from the doorway, and made his way to their bedroom. And that is when he saw her, but Tony didn't really understand what it was that he was seeing. There was his girlfriend Eve, lay face down on their bedroom floor, but she wasn't moving. Tony knelt down beside Eve and pulled back her hair, which was covering her face and neck, and that's when he registered the dampness. He was leaning in something wet. He was leaning in Eve's blood. When police and detectives arrived to the Lyndhurst Drive flat, they were met with a traumatising scene, one that they said was the most violent, graphic and brutal crime scenes that they had ever seen or worked on. Eve Stratford was found partially dressed, wearing only a pink bra with matching underwear and a blue negligee which was open at the front. Her hands were bound behind her back with a scarf, and there had been an attempt to also bind her feet, a nylon stocking found tied around one of her ankles. Across her neck, Eve had had her throat cut between 8 to 12 times from ear to ear with so much force and ferocity that she was almost decapitated. Her face and her neck were also extensively mutilated. Detectives would later learn that she had also been sexually assaulted, the killer leaving behind a semen sample. At the scene, detectives began their investigation and they realised that there was no sign of forced entry and no sign of a struggle. Now initially, that made some detectives believe that Eve must have known her killer and invited them inside, but it's also entirely possible that she was caught completely off guard as she walked into her flat and she was terrified, scared into submission. The flowers that she was seen carrying were found discarded in the door/entryway of the flat, which to some further proved that she was intercepted almost immediately upon walking through her door. If her killer was someone that she had invited in, why wouldn't she carry the flowers upstairs with her? The murder weapon, which must have been a quote, substantially sized, very sharp knife, wasn't recovered at the scene, and as far as I could see, there was nothing reported about this knife coming from the flat. There was nothing missing there, so the killer had brought it with him. During the searches of the surrounding area in and outside of the flat, officers would find something chilling, something that gave them a potential idea of the killer's motive. Discarded nearby was a copy of Eve's Mayfair magazine, the one that had only been out for a couple of days, where she was posing nude. Within the article, she discussed how she had a submissive preference, but that she didn't like being tied up. She also said that she lived alone with her cat, which we obviously know isn't true. She lived in a flat with her boyfriend, and she also had neighbours downstairs, but any random Joe that was reading this article wouldn't know that. So because of that second part, because of that lie, we really don't know if anything she said in the article was fact or if it was fiction. But what was heartbreaking to me and what really stood out was the fact that Eve mentioned that she didn't like being tied up, and yet that is exactly what the killer had done to her. There was an early theory that maybe the killer had had a fixation, an obsession on Eve. Maybe he was a regular at the Playboy club or someone who would target her from the Mayfair magazine cover. The copy of the magazine that was discovered nearby Eve's home was found in a torn up condition. Could this suggest that the killer was angry at Eve? Found alongside this Mayfair magazine, there were other adult explicit magazines. So it wasn't just that one by itself, but definitely worth a mention. Of course, Tony Priest was taken to the station and thoroughly questioned, treated like their main suspect. It really goes without saying, he is both the boyfriend and the person who discovered the body. Tony openly answered all questions throughout the interview and provided a blood sample to be compared to the DNA found in Eve, which detectives were 100% certain belonged to her killer. This was able to rule him out, and Tony said that he never minded doing anything that was asked of him because he knew that he had done nothing wrong, and if anything, he just wanted to help by doing anything that he could. The less time that the detectives spent looking at him, they could put that time and energy into searching for the actual killer. Tony did express a curiosity about a man from the Playboy club who he thought was named Ali. Here he might have been referring to a man named Abdul who was thoroughly looked into during the investigation. Abdul was a very powerful man within the club. He was a regular who liked to show off and wasn't really liked that much. It was actually him who brought in Eve's copy of the Mayfair magazine, showing it off to people within the club while she was there working, which of course we know resulted in her getting suspended. I'm not going to delve into Abdul much more than that because he would be ruled out from the investigation many years later, years after his death, by DNA. When talking to Eve's downstairs neighbour to see if she knew or heard anything, she told the detectives that that day she had been at home. She was either with her own or babysitting some children. At about 4:30 p.m, she heard Eve talking to a man, but she didn't recognise his voice. She couldn't really make out what they were saying. She probably wasn't really taking much notice because the conversation seemed very calm. It wasn't like Eve and this man were shouting, screaming, arguing at each other. It was just like they were having a general conversation. Then, this woman said that she heard a thump, similar to how you would imagine a chair falling over sounding, just one singular thud, and then the sound of footsteps, followed by silence. If Eve was intercepted as soon as she got into her home shortly after 3:30 p.m, and that thud that her neighbour heard was Eve's body hitting the ground, that meant she had been alive with her killer for an hour before she was murdered, and then discovered by her boyfriend not even an hour later. How someone can be sexually assaulted and murdered in such a brutal way without making barely any noise is completely unbelievable to me. Like, I believe it, but I just can't believe it if that makes any sense. Composite sketches were created of two men who were spotted by witnesses nearby the flat at a very interesting time. Those two men have never came forward and they have never been tracked down. Detectives would somehow learn that Eve had been receiving some strange phone calls on the days leading up to, and actually on the day of her murder. The phone would ring and Eve would pick it up saying hello, but the person on the other end never spoke. There was just an unsettling silence. Detectives worked through and followed up on as many leads as they could. Tony was ruled out. Abdul was eventually ruled out many years later. They put a lot of time and focus into him for some reason, but again he would be ruled out. They looked into other regulars at the Playboy club, many of them whom were questioned. 40 officers took over 400 statements from different people. 250 people were fingerprinted, but all of that legwork resulted in nothing. With nothing really else to go on, the detectives started going through different theories. Like, for example, could Eve have had a secret lover? I guess it was possible. It definitely wasn't impossible, but it was really unlikely. She was never described to be the type of person who would cheat on Tony, whom she dearly loved, and again, Tony said they were planning on running off and getting married together. But if she did have a secret boyfriend, why would she bring him to her flat where Tony could have walked in at any minute and caught them in the act? Not even just that, but maybe one of the neighbours could have saw Eve sneaking a man in, and maybe they would have mentioned something to Tony. That just seemed too risky. Is it possible that Eve could have had a stalker? Could someone have decided to follow her home from the tube station? The police and detectives worked on Eve's case tirelessly, and there was extensive media coverage of it, but no matter what lead they followed and whom they questioned, they got no closer to finding answers. And so, the murder of Eve Stratford went cold. Lynne Weedon was born on the 11th of November 1958 and grew up in Hounslow, West London. She lived with her parents, Fred and Margaret, who described Lynne as almost the perfect daughter. Here is Margaret.
I would think she was probably almost the perfect daughter that anybody could have had. And I'm not just saying that because she was my daughter. Everybody was, the same opinion.
Lynne was the type of girl who got along with everyone. She was described as a great girl who had an amazing sense of humour. She could take a joke, she was a laugh and carry on, and she had a canny little group of friends, but her best friend was named Rosemary. They had a bond which was likeness to them being sisters. They would call each other their special friends. Alongside Rosemary, Lynne's best friend was her dog, who she absolutely loved to bits. She was very intelligent, she was able to speak both French and German, and she had aspirations of going to college and then university and wanting to get a career as a bilingual secretary, which would have opened so many doors for her. She may have just been a young girl, but she had big hopes, dreams, aspirations, and solid plans for the future. Ones that she would never get to experience. On the 3rd of September 1975, 16-year-old Lynne got on the bus to Rosemary's house where the two teens sat together getting ready because they were going out that night to celebrate their O-level results. They listened to music while doing each other's hair and their makeup and were ready for a good night. They went to the Elm Tree pub situated on New Heston Road. Here they met other friends and took over the pool table, having a couple of games between 1 or 2 drinks and just chatting, enjoying each other's company. They weren't the type of friends who were going to be going out and getting absolutely legless pelagic drunk. This was like a very typical night for them. At around 11 p.m, the group decided to call it a night. They all left the pub together before going their separate ways to head home. Lynne decided to walk down a dark alleyway, which was then known as Short Hedges, but it's now known as School Walk. It would have been pitch black and was somewhere that her parents had told her not to walk down, but it was a shortcut. It was late, it's probably getting cold, and Lynne just wanted to get home as quick as possible. She was almost at the end of the alleyway, 50 yards away from the comfort of her own home, when Lynne Weedon was attacked. She was struck over the head with a blunt instrument, potentially a length of metal pole, with so much force that it fractured her skull. The attacker lifted Lynne up from the ground and physically threw her over a wire fence onto the grounds of an electricity place. He then dragged her body out of sight of anyone who may walk past, and then he viciously raped Lynne before fleeing, leaving her lying on the grass. She would be discovered the next morning just after 7:30 a.m, and when she was discovered, she was still alive, unconscious, but breathing and with a pulse. According to Rosemary, when she was found, Lynne's underwear had been stuffed down her throat. Lynne was rushed to the hospital, and it's at around about this point that her parents are waking up and realising that she hadn't come home. They tried not to worry, and the first thing that they did was ring Rosemary's mum. Maybe Lynne had ended up going back there and stopping over the night, but to their horror, she hadn't. They would eventually discover that their daughter was in West Middlesex Hospital on life support and was in a coma. The injury that she had sustained to her head had left Lynne with severe brain damage. She was in this coma for a full week before Fred and Margaret had to make one of the most difficult decisions in their lives and took their daughter off of the life support. Lynne never regained consciousness and passed away on the 10th of September 1975. Police had already been trying to track down the attacker and now the killer. They received multiple tips about whom they believed was the same man. Here is an officer describing what they learned from the witnesses.
On the night that Lynne was attacked, a man was out walking his dog when he saw a white male walking down the alleyway. A few moments later, a couple of witnesses coming out of a house here described seeing a man, who I think is the same, running across the Great West Way and down into the alleyway. I'm convinced this was Lynne's attacker.
A DNA sample was extracted from Lynne, which the killer had left behind, but there wasn't much that the investigators were able to do with it, and just like with Eve's case, after exhausting every single investigative avenue into Lynne Weedon's murder and coming up with nothing, her case soon went cold. There was a period of time when it was thought that the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, aka Peter Sutcliffe, could have been a suspect in Lynne's murder. Despite him mostly being a northern-based serial killer, an author wrote in his book about some striking similarities between those cases and that of Lynne's. Peter was known to attack lone women from behind in alleyways and striking them over the back of the head, which is exactly what happened to Lynne. During the time of her murder, there was a possibility that Peter Sutcliffe was in London and not up north. See, he had a sister-in-law who lived somewhere in London, and the week of Lynne's murder, it's possible that Peter was there because they went on holiday flying from Heathrow Airport, which is basically right next to Hounslow, where Lynne was murdered. The evidence against Peter Sutcliffe was shaky at best though, and entirely circumstantial. The DNA profile would eventually completely rule him out. After Lynne's case being cold for almost 30 years, it was reopened in 2004. It was passed on to a murder review team who basically looked at cold cases to see if there was anything they could use to investigate with, anything that could help them close this case. The DCI who got Lynne's case sent off the semen sample for analysis to see if anything could be lifted from it, a DNA profile, hopefully one that was in the system with a name attached to it. It wasn't until 2007 that finally they got a match. But this match wasn't to a person who the DNA belonged to, it was a match to another case. This man's DNA was found at another crime scene, and that was the murder of Eve Stratford. Eve had been killed inside of her flat in Leyton 6 months before Lynne was attacked in the alleyway in Hounslow. The two cases weren't even initially considered to have been connected. The cases happened about 20 miles away from each other. They were both sexually motivated, but Eve was tied up and had her throat slit so many times that she was almost decapitated, and Lynne was struck over the head with a blunt object. Those are very different MOs. Despite these differences, the DNA conclusively linked both of the cases, but the officers were still no closer to discovering who the DNA belonged to. Eve and Lynne had both been murdered before it became really a thing for criminals or prisoners to provide DNA sample upon their arrests. That didn't properly come in until around about 1995, so it's entirely possible that this man had a previous criminal history and was either still incarcerated or he had just never committed or been caught for other crimes. We know very little about this perpetrator. This is a detective on a Crime Watch episode sharing what we do know about him.
Their name.
What do we know about the suspect and what do we know about the two murders?
What we do know is that the killer had a link to the Leytonstone area in March 1975 and to the Hounslow area in September, and in particular to the Hounslow area. He would have been familiar with the alleyway called the Short Hedges. He would have been a white male, aged between 17 and 30 at the time of the murders.
And the murder weapons never found?
Now, in both cases, murder weapons were removed from the scene. In the case of Eve, it was a knife, and in Lynne's murder, it was a blunt instrument similar to a piece of lead pipe.
And can you give us a bit more detail of who you feel you're looking for?
Well, we feel that the answer could come from professionals, from psychiatrists, from support, from probation, and even prison officers. Back here 40 years ago, someone may have made admissions to you or a disclosure that you didn't think was relevant at the time, but looking at all this information now, you may have a different view. We would ask you to make that call. And equally, a cellmate may have received a disclosure from a fellow criminal.
As of today, the murders of Eve Stratford and Lynne Weedon are still unsolved. There is a £40,000 reward available for information leading to an arrest. Their killer would likely be in his late 60s, early 70s now, so there is still time for justice, still time to name this monster who many believe didn't stop at just Eve and Lynne. There are at least 3 other cases of women murdered in London with some striking similar circumstances to that of Eve and Lynne. And I'm going to tell you all about those women in next week's episode. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. Don't forget to follow the podcast so that you never miss a new upload. You can find photos and updates over on Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn. I appreciate you for being here, and I'll catch you all on the next one.